Sometimes a man's last chance costs $50 and everything he has left to lose. 60-year-old Walt Delaney spent his life working land he'd never own, watching younger men inherit dreams he could only imagine. When a forgotten ranch went up for auction in Wyoming, he bought it with his last bills. 3 days later, he returned with supplies and a stubborn donkey to find strangers loading his cattle onto trucks. They had papers. They called him a trespasser. His deed meant nothing. Someone powerful wanted that land, and the law was on their side. What happens when an old cowboy's word is all he has left and nobody believes him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Walt Delaney first saw the ranch, the Wyoming sky stretched pale and endless above him. The kind of blue that made a man feel small and significant all at once. He stood at the edge of the property line, if you could call it that, with nothing but a crumpled auction receipt in his shirt pocket, and a sense that this might be the last real decision he'd ever make. The land itself wasn't much to look at. 50 acres of windswept grassland, a listing barn that looked ready to surrender to the next strong gust, and a ranch house with more gaps than walls. The paint had peeled away years ago, leaving bare wood the color of old bones. But Walt saw past all that. He saw his grandfather's stories come to life. Tales told on cold winter nights about Wyoming ranches where a man could stand on his own porch and see nothing but his own land reaching toward the horizon. Walt had turned 63 weeks ago. Though he'd stopped celebrating birthdays around the time his knees started reminding him of every bad decision he'd made in his youth. He was a lean man, weathered in the way that comes from decades of outdoor work, with hands that bore the calluses of a lifetime spent holding reins, mending fences, and doing the hard labor that other men owned the profits from. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes remained sharp and clear, the eyes of someone who'd spent years watching horizons and reading weather in cloud formations. He'd been a ranch hand his entire adult life. Started at 16, working for the Crawfords up in Montana, then the Hendersons in Colorado, the McCalls in Nebraska, always moving when the work dried up, or when younger men came along, willing to do the same job for less money. He'd never married, never had children, never put down roots deep enough to call any place home. His life had been a series of bunkhouses and borrowed beds, good horses he'd loved and had to leave behind, and the quiet understanding that some men were meant to work the land but never own it. Until now. The town of Clearwater, Wyoming, wasn't much more than a handful of buildings clustered around a single main street. Population 217, according to the faded sign at the town limits. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers were noticed before they'd even parked their trucks. Walt had passed through years ago, back when he was working for a cattle outfit that had since gone under, and he remembered the town being a bit more alive then. Now it had that hollow feeling of a place that was slowly emptying out. Young people leaving for cities and opportunities. Old-timers hanging on out of stubbornness or lack of anywhere else to go. The auction had been held in the county clerk's office, a cramped room that smelled of old paper and floor wax. Only 6 people had shown up, and most of them were there out of curiosity rather than intent to bid. The ranch had belonged to a man named Garrett Hayes, who died without heirs and with enough back taxes that the county had finally seized the property. The auctioneer, a tired-looking woman with reading glasses on a chain, had started the bidding at $500. Nobody raised a hand. She'd dropped it to $250, then $100. Finally, with a look of resigned frustration, she'd called out, "Do I hear $50? $50 for 50 acres and structures?" Walt's hand had gone up before he'd fully thought it through. $50 was most of what he had left after buying gas and supplies for the month. It was reckless. It was foolish. It was the kind of decision a young man made, not someone his age who should know better, but when the gavel came down and the clerk handed him the deed, a single piece of paper with an embossed seal and faded typescript, Walt felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Hope, maybe. or purpose. The feeling that his life might still have one more chapter left to write. The clerk, a stout woman named Marianne, who'd been working in that office for 30 years, had given him a long look over her glasses. "You know that place needs a lot of work, Mr. Delaney." "I know it," Walt had said. "And you're aware the water rights might be complicated?" Old Garrett had disputes about the creek running through the eastern section. "I'll figure it out." She'd studied him a moment longer, then softened slightly. "Well, good luck to you. Lord knows this town could use someone willing to put work into something instead of just letting it all fall apart." That had been 4 days ago. Walt had spent the first day walking every inch of the property, mapping it in his mind. The barn needed a new roof, but the frame was solid oak, built by someone who'd known what they were doing. The house required windows, insulation, a functioning door, and probably a complete rebuild of the kitchen, but it had good bones. The land itself was the real treasure. Gently rolling hills with good grass, a creek that ran year-round according to the county records, and stands of cottonwood trees that provided natural windbreaks. On the second day, he'd found the cattle, 15 head, maybe 20, scattered in the far northern section near the creek. They were skinny and half-wild, Herefords mostly, with a few crossbreeds mixed in. Garrett Hayes must have left them when he got too sick to manage the ranch, and they'd survived on their own, through sheer stubbornness. Walt had approached them slowly, speaking soft and low, the way you did with animals that had forgotten human kindness. They'd watched him with wary eyes but hadn't bolted. Those cattle represented possibility. With proper care and feeding, they could be the start of a real herd. They could be income. They could be the foundation of something that lasted. On the third day, Walt had loaded his few possessions into his ancient pickup truck and prepared for the 3-day round trip into town for supplies. He needed fence posts, barbed wire, tools, grain for the cattle, and about 100 other things he couldn't afford. But he'd figure it out. He always had. The only companion he'd brought with him was Rufus. Rufus was a donkey, a gray, stubborn, temperamental creature Walt had acquired 6 years ago when a rancher in Kansas couldn't afford to feed him anymore. Donkeys lived a long time, and Rufus was only middle-aged by donkey standards, which meant Walt figured they'd probably die around the same time. It seemed fitting. Rufus had a habit of braying at inappropriate moments, refused to be rushed, and had opinions about everything. Walt appreciated that in a companion. "You behave while I'm gone," Walt had told him, running a hand down the donkey's neck. "Keep an eye on those cattle. Don't let them wander too far." Rufus had looked at him with those large, knowing eyes that donkeys have, and Walt had the distinct impression the animal thought he was being ridiculous. The trip to town had taken longer than expected. His truck had overheated twice, and he'd had to stop for repairs at a garage in Rawlins, where the mechanic had looked at his engine and whistled low. "You're held together with prayers and rust." "Old-timer, story of my life," Walt had replied. He'd bought what he could afford, made a list of what he couldn't, and spent one night in the cab of his truck in a rest area parking lot. Too tired and too broke for a motel. He dreamed of the ranch, of cattle grazing on green grass, of smoke rising from the chimney of a house he'd repaired with his own hands. Simple dreams. Honest dreams. The drive back had been slower, his truck weighted down with supplies. He'd taken the back roads, the ones that wound through high country where pronghorn antelope grazed, and the wind carried the scent of sage. The sun had been setting as he finally turned onto the dirt road that led to his property. His property. Those words still felt strange, and he'd felt his chest expand with something close to contentment. Then he'd seen the trucks. 3 of them, big commercial livestock haulers, parked in a line near his barn. Men moved around them with purpose, loading cattle up a ramp. His cattle. The skinny Herefords he'd found, the crossbreeds, all of them being herded and pushed and driven into the dark interiors of those trucks. Walt had pulled his pickup to a stop, dust billowing around him, and climbed out slowly. His knees protested, but he ignored them. 6 men worked the cattle, and one more leaned against the hood of a silver Ford F-350, watching the operation with the casual confidence of someone who owned everything he surveyed. This man was younger than Walt by maybe 20 years, dressed in clean jeans and a pressed shirt with a black cowboy hat that looked expensive. He had the kind of face that belonged on campaign posters, handsome in a practiced way, with a jaw that suggested he'd never missed a meal and eyes that calculated value before seeing humanity. Walt approached him, his boots crunching on gravel. "Help you with something?" the man said, not moving from his casual lean. "Those are my cattle you're loading," Walt said. His voice came out steady, which surprised him. His heart was hammering hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. The man smiled, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Your cattle?" "I don't think so, friend. These belong to sovereign land holdings. We're clearing them out before we start development work. Development work on my land." Now the man straightened up, pulling a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "Your land. See, that's interesting, because according to this deed, certified and filed with the county recorder's office 3 days ago, this property belongs to Sovereign. Has for about 72 hours now." Walt's hand went to his own pocket, to the auction receipt and the deed he'd been given. The paper felt suddenly thin and insubstantial beneath his fingers. "I bought this place at a county auction," Walt said. "I've got the deed right here." "County auction." The man's smile widened. "Now that's unfortunate. See, there was an issue with that auction. The property wasn't actually the county's to sell. Old Garrett Hayes had signed over the deed to Sovereign 6 months before he died, settling some debts. The county just didn't have updated records. It happens. That's not possible. It's very possible, and it's very legal. You can take it up with the county if you want. Get your $50 back." The man's tone suggested he found the amount amusing. "But these cattle, this land, that barn over there, all of it belongs to Sovereign now. You're trespassing, friend. I'm being polite by not calling the sheriff." Walt looked past him, at his cattle being loaded into trucks, at men walking across land he'd spent 4 days learning to love. He looked at the barn he'd planned to repair, the house he'd imagined making whole. "Who are you?" Walt asked quietly. "Name's Cassidy Murdoch. I'm the regional acquisition manager for Sovereign." "And you are?" "Walt Delaney." "Well, Mr. Delaney, I'm truly sorry about your situation. But business is business, and this land is ours. I'm going to have to ask you to collect your things and move along." Behind Walt, Rufus let out a long, mournful bray from where he was tied to the back of the pickup. It sounded like a lament for something not yet lost, or maybe for everything that already had been. Walt stood there in the fading light, watching his future being loaded onto trucks by men who didn't know him and didn't care to. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the smell of cattle and something else, the acrid scent of opportunity slipping away. "I'd like to see that deed," Walt said. Cassidy Murdoch shrugged and unfolded the paper, holding it out but not letting go. Walt leaned in to read it. The document looked official enough, embossed seal, legal language, signatures at the bottom. Garrett Hayes' name appeared in shaky handwriting, near a date that was indeed 6 months before the old man died. Next to it, a notary seal and another signature Walt didn't recognize. "This could be anything," Walt said. "It's recorded with the county, filed and legal. You can check yourself if you don't believe me." Cassidy refolded the paper and tucked it back into his pocket. "Look, I understand you're upset. You thought you had something here. But sometimes things don't work out the way we plan. That's life, right?" The casual dismissiveness of it, the way this younger man could stand there and wave away Walt's last chance like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, sent a surge of something hot through Walt's chest. Not quite anger, closer to a bone-deep weariness at how the world worked, at how it had always worked, at how men with money and papers could take from men with calloused hands and empty pockets. "I'm not leaving," Walt said. Cassidy's smile faded. "I'm sorry?" "You heard me. This is my land. I bought it fair and legal at a county auction. I've got the receipt and the deed. Until someone official, someone wearing a badge or sitting behind a judge's bench tells me different, I'm staying. That's not wise. Probably not. But I'm 60 years old, and I've spent my entire life being wise, following rules, moving along when I was told to. And where'd that get me?" Walt gestured at the empty space around them. This is all I've got, and I'm not giving it up without a fight. One of the workers, a young man with sun-bleached hair, approached Cassidy. "Boss, we've got all the cattle loaded. You want us to start moving out?" Cassidy kept his eyes on Walt, measuring something. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, move out. And take the cattle to the riverside holding pens. We'll sort them there." The young man jogged back to the trucks. Engines rumbled to life, and one by one the big haulers began pulling away, carrying Walt's cattle down the dirt road and out of sight. Walt watched them go, each truck taking a piece of the future he'd imagined. When the sound of the engines had faded, Cassidy spoke again. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Maybe. The sheriff's name is Tom Brickland. Good man, fair man, but he follows the law, and the law says this property belongs to Sovereign. If I call him out here, he's going to tell you the same thing I'm telling you. Leave peacefully, or leave in handcuffs. Your choice." "Why?" Walt asked. "Why does Sovereign want this land?" "It's nothing special. 50 acres of wind-swept grass and a falling-down barn." For the first time, Cassidy's carefully maintained expression shifted, revealing something calculating underneath. "We're developing the entire valley. Residential properties, vacation homes, maybe a resort if the market supports it. This piece sits right in the middle of a larger parcel we've been assembling. Without it, the whole project is fragmented, so you need it, we want it." "There's a difference," Walt nodded slowly, understanding settling over him like winter cold. "And old Garrett, he signed it over. That's what the deed says. Man spent 40 years on this land, built that barn himself. Raised cattle here, raised a family here before they all moved away. He loved this place. And you're telling me he just signed it over to settle debts?" "People do what they have to when circumstances force their hand, or maybe that signature isn't real. Maybe someone helped old Garrett with his penmanship when he was too sick to know what he was signing." Cassidy's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation." They stood there in the gathering darkness. Two men separated by more than just age, separated by everything that made one man's word weightless and another man's word law. Walt could feel the exhaustion in his bones, the miles he'd driven, the hope he'd allowed himself to feel, and the speed with which it had been stripped away. "I'll give you until morning," Cassidy said finally. "After that, I make the call to Sheriff Brickland. Be smart, Mr. Delaney. Take the loss and move on. There's nothing here worth destroying what's left of your life over." He walked to his truck, climbed in, and drove away without looking back. The silver F-350's taillights disappeared down the road, leaving Walt alone with Rufus, and the question of what a man did when the ground he stood on was no longer his to stand on. Walt walked slowly to the barn. The interior was dark and smelled of old hay and mouse droppings. He found a kerosene lantern on a shelf, lit it, and held it up. The space around him came into flickering view. Old tools hanging on walls, a workbench scarred with decades of use. Coils of rope and leather tack that Garrett Hayes had probably handled 1,000 times. On the workbench, Walt found something. A small wooden box, dust-covered but solid. He opened it carefully. Inside were papers, letters mostly yellowed with age. He lifted them out gently, holding them near the lantern light. The letters were addressed to Garrett Hayes from someone named Margaret, written over the course of what looked like 40 years. Love letters, some of them. Others were practical notes about ranch business, about children growing up, about the good years and the hard ones. Walt read a few, feeling like he was intruding on something private, something sacred. At the bottom of the box, he found a photograph. It showed a younger Garrett standing in front of this same barn, newly built then, the wood still bright, with his arm around a woman who must have been Margaret. They were both smiling, truly smiling, the kind of smile people got when they'd built something together and knew it would last. Walt set the photograph down carefully and looked around the barn again. This place had been someone's life. It had meant something. And now strangers were claiming it, preparing to tear it down and build vacation homes for people who'd never understand what it had taken to carve a life out of this hard land. He thought about Cassidy Murdoch's advice. Be smart, take the loss and move on. It was good advice, Sensible advice. The kind of advice Walt had followed his entire life. But something in him, something stubborn and probably foolish, refused to accept it this time. He extinguished the lantern and walked out of the barn into the night. The stars overhead were bright and numerous, the way they only got in places far from cities. Rufus stood by the pickup truck, ears forward, waiting. "We're staying," Walt told him. The donkey made a sound that might have been approval or might have been skepticism. With Rufus, it was hard to tell. Walt unloaded his supplies from the truck, carrying fence posts and bags of grain into the barn. He set up a simple camp, a bedroll on the floor, his few possessions arranged within reach. He wasn't sure what morning would bring. Sheriff Brickland in handcuffs, maybe. Or maybe Cassidy Murdoch would decide it wasn't worth the trouble and find some other way to handle the situation. But for tonight, for these few hours before dawn, this was his land, his barn, his dream, however fragile. He lay down on the bedroll and stared up at the barn's ceiling, at the gaps between boards where starlight showed through. His grandfather used to say that a man wasn't defined by what he owned, but by what he was willing to stand up for when everything else was stripped away. Walt had never fully understood that until now. Tomorrow would come with its complications and conflicts. But tonight he was home. Walt woke before dawn to the sound of Rufus braying his morning complaints. The bedroll had done little to cushion the barn's floor, and Walt felt every one of his 60 years in his back and hips as he pushed himself upright. Outside, the sky was turning from black to deep blue, that brief window before sunrise when the world held its breath. He fed Rufus first. Donkeys were particular about their routines. Then made coffee on a small camping stove he'd set up in the corner of the barn. The coffee was bitter and strong, the way he liked it, and he sipped it slowly while standing in the open barn doorway, watching the land wake up. No trucks yet, no sheriff, no Cassidy Murdoch with his practiced smile and legal papers. Just the wind moving through grass and the distant call of a hawk starting its morning hunt. Walt spent the first hours after sunrise walking the property again, this time with different eyes. If he was going to defend his claim to this land, he needed to understand it completely. He followed the creek along the eastern boundary, noting where it ran deep and where it spread shallow across smooth stones. He examined the fencing, what little remained, and found old survey stakes that marked the property lines. Near the southern edge, he discovered something interesting. A stone marker, weathered but still readable, with dates carved into it that went back more than 100 years. This land had been homesteaded, claimed under the old laws that gave settlers ownership if they worked the land and improved it. Garrett Hayes' family might have been here for generations. When Walt returned to the barn around mid-morning, he found a visitor waiting. An old Ford pickup, even more battered than his own, was parked near the house. A woman sat on the truck's tailgate, legs swinging, a thermos in her hands. She was somewhere in her 70s, Walt guessed, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and a face that had seen plenty of sun and wind. She wore work clothes, canvas pants and a flannel shirt, and regarded him with sharp, appraising eyes as he approached. "You must be the fool who bought Garrett's place," she said. "I'm Walt Delaney, Evelyn Morris. I've got the ranch next door, about 3 miles east. Heard from Tom Brickland that there might be trouble out here." Walt's shoulders tensed. "Is Sheriff coming?" "Not yet. Tom's a friend. Called to give me a heads up before he made any official moves. Said some company claims they own this land and you're refusing to leave." She poured coffee from her thermos into the cap, offering it to him. "That about right?" Walt accepted the coffee. "More or less. Sovereign land holdings. You know them." Evelyn's expression darkened. "They've been buying up property all through this valley for the past 2 years. Started with the Peterson Ranch, then the old McAllister place, then 3 or 4 smaller parcels. They pay well enough that folks don't ask too many questions. But Garrett, he swore he'd never sell. Said this land had been in his family since his great-grandfather homesteaded it, and he'd die before he let developers turn it into vacation condos." "That's what I figured," Walt said. "But they've got a deed saying he signed over the property 6 months before he died." 6 months. Evelyn shook her head slowly. Garrett was in the hospital 6 months before he died. Cancer had him pretty bad. He wasn't signing anything those last months, could barely hold a pen. Something sharp and hopeful stirred in Walt's chest. You sure about that? I visited him 3 times a week. Watched him fade. He talked about this place constantly, worried about what would happen to it after he was gone. Had no children, no close family. But he never mentioned selling, never mentioned Sovereign. Walt thought about the letters he'd found, about Margaret and 40 years of building something together. Did you know his wife, Margaret? Course I did. Good woman. Died about 10 years back. Garrett was never the same after. Evelyn studied Walt over her coffee. You planning to fight this? Don't know if I have a choice. There's always a choice. You could walk away. That'd be the smart thing, probably. Sovereign has lawyers and money, and you've got, what? A $50 receipt. And a legal deed from a county auction, which they'll say was invalid. They'll tie you up in court for years if you let them, cost you money you don't have. She paused. But I'll tell you something. This valley used to be full of working ranches, families who'd been here for generations. Now it's getting bought up piece by piece, turned into something that's got nothing to do with the land or the people who understood it. If you're inclined to make a stand, there are folks around here who'd appreciate it enough to help. Evelyn smiled, a quick flash of something fierce. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But I can tell you this, if Garrett Hayes's signature is on that deed, it's either a forgery or it was obtained when he was too sick to know what he was signing. Either way, that's fraud. And fraud's something even fancy lawyers have trouble explaining away. I'd need proof. Hospital records might show when he was admitted, how sick he was. Medical testimony about whether he was competent to sign legal documents. She climbed down from the tailgate, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints hurt but who wouldn't admit it. There's also the land records office. Every deed gets recorded, but sometimes people get sloppy with the details. Might be worth looking into. Walt felt something unfamiliar, not quite hope, but maybe the foundation hope could build on.
Why are you helping me?
Because Garrett was my friend, and I don't like seeing his land stolen. Because this valley deserves better than being carved up and sold to the highest bidder. And because, she met his eyes directly, because sometimes you get to be my age and realize you're tired of watching the world go to hell without at least trying to push back. She gave him her phone number, written on a scrap of paper in shaky handwriting, and told him to call if he needed anything. Then she drove away, her old truck rattling down the road and leaving a trail of dust. Walt spent the afternoon going through more of Garrett's possessions in the barn. He found old ledgers that showed years of careful accounting, receipts for equipment purchases, vaccination records for cattle. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd taken meticulous care of this place, who'd understood every inch of it and recorded every decision. Among the papers, he found more letters from Margaret. One in particular caught his attention. It was dated 15 years ago, written in a clear, flowing hand. "My dearest Garrett," it read, "I know you worry about what will happen to the ranch after we're gone. But remember what your grandfather told you. This land isn't just property to be bought and sold. It's a trust, passed from generation to generation. Guard it well and it will guard you." Walt folded the letter carefully and put it back with the others. The words felt like they'd been meant for him, even though they'd been written for someone else. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Walt heard the sound of an engine approaching. His stomach tightened, expecting Cassidy Murdoch or Sheriff Brickland or some new complication he wasn't ready to face. Instead, it was Evelyn again, her truck bed loaded with supplies. She got out and started unloading without explanation. Food, water jugs, a better camping stove, blankets. "If you're staying, you'll need more than what you've got," she said. Walt helped her unload, grateful and a bit overwhelmed. When they finished, he asked, "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing. Consider it an investment in stubbornness." She looked at the barn, at the house beyond it, at the land stretching toward the horizon. "Garrett would have liked you, I think." You've got the same fool streak he had, the kind that makes a man fight for what's right, even when it's not smart. After she left, Walt stood alone in the fading light and wondered if she was right. If this was about what was right, or just about an old man's desperate need to finally have something he could call his own. Sheriff Tom Brickland arrived the next morning in an official vehicle that announced itself long before it came into view. Walt had been expecting him, had prepared himself for this conversation, but his heart still hammered as he watched the SUV pull up near the barn. The sheriff was a solid man in his 50s, with the build of someone who'd played football in high school and had spent the decades since fighting to keep that weight from turning soft. He wore his uniform with casual authority and approached Walt with a carefully neutral expression. "Mr. Delaney," he said, extending a hand. Walt shook it. The grip was firm but not aggressive. "I'm Sheriff Brickland. Mind if we talk a minute? Already know why you're here." "I expect you do." Brickland looked around at the property, taking it in with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of disputes over land. "Got a call from Sovereign Land Holdings. They say you're trespassing on their property, refusing to leave despite being asked peacefully." "It's not their property. It's mine. You bought it at the county auction 4 days ago. $50. I've got the receipt and the deed." Brickland nodded slowly. "And they've got a deed saying Garrett Hayes signed the property over to them 6 months before he died. I've seen it. It's filed with the county recorder, all proper and legal. Garrett Hayes was dying of cancer 6 months before he passed. Too sick to sign his name, according to people who knew him. That's a serious claim. It's the truth." The sheriff took off his hat and ran a hand through thinning hair. "Look, Mr. Delaney, I'm not a judge. I can't sort out who's got the rightful claim here. What I can tell you is that this is a civil matter, not a criminal one. Unless you're threatening violence or destroying property, I can't force you off this land. But I also can't stop Sovereign from taking this to court and getting an injunction." Walt felt a small measure of relief. "So I can stay? For now. But understand, if a judge issues an order saying you need to leave and you don't, then it becomes my problem. And I will enforce that order." "Fair enough." Brickland settled his hat back on his head. "Evelyn Morris called me this morning. Said you might need someone to look at the official records, see if there are any irregularities in how Sovereign's deed was filed. That'd be helpful. I can't do it officially. Can't show favoritism in what might become a legal dispute. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "there's a woman named Patricia Reeves who works in the county recorder's office. She's been there 30 years, knows every filing backwards and forwards. She's also a cousin of Garrett's late wife. If anyone would be interested in making sure things were done properly, it'd be her." Walt understood what wasn't being said. "I appreciate that. Don't thank me yet. You're in for a fight if you keep this up. Sovereign's got resources you don't have." "I've noticed." Brickland studied him for a long moment. "Why? Why fight for this particular piece of land? You seem like a reasonable man. You could take the $50 back, find something else, somewhere else." It was the same question Walt had been asking himself. The reasonable answer, the one that made sense, was that he was being stubborn and foolish. But the true answer ran deeper, into places he couldn't fully articulate. "I'm 60 years old," Walt said finally. "I've worked other men's land my whole life, been a hired hand, moved on when I wasn't needed. This is the first thing I've ever owned. The first place I ever looked at and thought, mine. Maybe that doesn't seem like much, but it's everything to me." The sheriff nodded, something like understanding crossing his face. "My dad was a ranch hand. Worked the Crawford place up in Montana for 40 years. Never owned an acre himself, but he knew that land better than the men who held the deed. Always said it hurt, knowing you could love something without ever truly having it. Sounds like he understood." He did. Brickland climbed back into his SUV. "Be careful, Mr. Delaney. Men like Cassidy Murdoch, they don't like being told no. They'll find ways to make things difficult." After the sheriff left, Walt hitched Rufus to a lead and walked the property again. The donkey plodded along beside him, occasionally stopping to crop at grass or investigate something that caught his attention. It was peaceful in a way Walt had rarely experienced. Just a man and an animal and land stretching out under an endless sky. He thought about what the sheriff had said, about how men with resources could make things difficult. Walt had no illusions about his chances in a prolonged legal battle. He had no money for lawyers, no connections, no power beyond his own stubbornness. But he had something else. He had the truth. And he had people like Evelyn who remembered Garrett Hayes and knew the kind of man he'd been. That afternoon, Walt drove into Clearwater. The town looked even smaller in daylight. A single main street with a handful of businesses, most of them struggling. He found the county building, a squat brick structure that housed several offices, including the county recorder. Patricia Reeves was exactly what Walt had expected. A thin woman with reading glasses and an air of precise efficiency. She looked up from her computer when Walt entered, and he saw recognition flicker across her face. "You're the man who bought Garrett's place," she said. "Walt Delaney." "I know. Marianne told me about the auction." She stood up, gesturing for him to follow her to a back room away from the front desk. Sheriff Brickland called. "Said you might have questions about property records. Sovereign's deed, the one that says Garrett signed over his land." "Can I see it?" Patricia pulled a file from a cabinet and opened it on a table. Inside was a copy of the deed Cassidy Murdoch had shown him, along with supporting documentation. Walt studied it carefully. The signature looked like Garrett's name, but the handwriting was shaky, uncertain. Nothing like the clear, confident script he'd seen in the letters Garrett had written to Margaret. "When was this filed?" Walt asked. 7 months ago. 3 weeks after it was supposedly signed. Who filed it? Patricia checked the paperwork. "A lawyer named Derek Ashford. He's part of a firm out of Denver that handles most of Sovereign's legal work." Walt made note of the name. "The notary seal. Is there any way to verify it's legitimate? I can check with the Notary Commission. See if there are any complaints or irregularities in this notary's record. But that'll take time." "I've got time." Patricia looked at him with something like sympathy. "Mr. Delaney, I should tell you, Sovereign has filed for 5 other properties in this valley in the past year. Every one of them went through without challenge. They know what they're doing. But you think something's wrong with this one." "I think," she chose her words carefully, "I think Garrett loved that land more than anything after Margaret died, and I think if he'd sold it, he would have mentioned it to someone. To me, at the very least. We had Sunday dinner together once a month for 8 years. He never said a word about Sovereign." She made copies of the relevant documents and gave them to Walt in a manila folder. As he was leaving, she said, "There's something else you should know. Sovereign's been asking the county about mineral rights surveys for that area. There's talk they might have found something, rare earth minerals maybe, or natural gas deposits. That land might be worth a lot more than anyone realized." Walt felt the pieces starting to come together. This wasn't just about development and vacation homes. There was something valuable under that soil, and Sovereign wanted it badly enough to forge documents and pressure an old man into signing away his legacy. He drove back to the ranch as the sun set, the manila folder on the seat beside him. He had evidence now, or at least the beginning of it. He had questions that needed answering, and a path forward that didn't involve simply giving up. Rufus greeted him with his usual complaints about being left alone too long. Walt fed him, and then stood in the barn doorway, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Tomorrow he'd start making calls, finding lawyers who might work on contingency, building a case that could stand up in court. But tonight he allowed himself to feel something dangerously close to hope. The lawyer Walt found willing to take his case was named Samuel Porter, a man in his late 40s who practiced out of a small office above a hardware store in Rawlins. He had the rumpled look of someone who worked long hours for modest pay, and when Walt explained his situation, Samuel had listened with the careful attention of someone who'd seen plenty of David versus Goliath stories and knew how most of them ended. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Delaney," Samuel said, leaning back in a chair that squeaked in protest. "This is going to be difficult. Sovereign has documentation that appears legitimate on its face. You're essentially arguing fraud. which is hard to prove without concrete evidence. I've got evidence that Garrett Hayes was hospitalized when he supposedly signed that deed, that he was too sick to know what he was doing. Medical records would help, but we'd need more. We'd need to show a pattern of deception, or find witnesses who can testify about Garrett's state of mind, or ideally, find something that proves the signature was forged. Samuel had agreed to work on contingency, which meant he'd only get paid if they won. It was the only arrangement Walt could afford, which also meant Samuel was taking a considerable risk. That made Walt respect him, even if it also made him worry about how hard the lawyer would actually fight when things got difficult. Over the next week, Walt threw himself into building a case while also trying to make the ranch functional. He repaired fences during the day, working until his hands bled and his back screamed. At night, he pored over documents by lamplight, trying to understand legal language that felt designed to confuse rather than clarify. Evelyn became a regular visitor, bringing food and occasionally helping with repairs. She was stronger than she looked and knew her way around tools and fence posts. More importantly, she knew the land and the people, and she helped Walt understand the web of relationships and history that defined this valley. The Peterson Ranch, she told him one afternoon while they worked on replacing rotted fence posts. Sovereign bought it 2 years ago. Old Jim Peterson was in debt after a bad drought year, and they offered him enough to clear everything and have money left over. He took it, moved to Arizona to be near his daughter. Died 6 months later. Heart attack, they said, but I think it was a broken heart. That ranch had been in his family for 4 generations. What happened to the land? Nothing yet. Sovereign owns it, but they haven't developed it. Just sitting there, empty. Same with the McAllister place, the Thornton property, and 3 others I know of. They're assembling pieces, waiting for something. Patricia Reeves mentioned mineral rights surveys. Evelyn nodded grimly. If there's something valuable under this valley, and Sovereign knows about it, they'll want to control as much land as possible before anyone else catches on. That's why they need your 50 acres. It's not about the land itself, it's about what's under it. Walt had contacted the hospital where Garrett had been treated, requesting medical records. The process was complicated by privacy laws and bureaucracy, but Samuel was working on getting a court order. In the meantime, Walt interviewed people who'd known Garrett, neighbors, former ranch hands, the pastor who'd performed Margaret's funeral service. Everyone told the same story. Garrett Hayes had been devoted to that land. He talked about it constantly, worried about its future, but never once mentioned selling or giving it away. Walt found a box of photographs in the house's attic, pictures spanning decades. Garrett and Margaret as young newlyweds, standing in front of the barn. The same couple years later with 2 children, both girls. The girls growing up, eventually moving away. Garrett and Margaret growing older. Lines deepening on their faces, but their hands still intertwined in every photo. The last picture in the box showed Garrett alone, standing in almost the exact spot where Walt had first seen him in the earlier photograph. But now he was old, his face gaunt with illness, his eyes carrying the particular sadness of someone who'd outlived everything he loved. Walt stared at that photograph for a long time, feeling the weight of all those years, all that history. This land wasn't just property. It was a life, a love story, a family's legacy, and someone had tried to steal it with forged documents and legal manipulation. On the 8th day after Sheriff Brickland's visit, Cassidy Murdoch returned. This time he brought a lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman from Denver who introduced herself as Jennifer Kane and immediately began explaining why Walt needed to vacate the property. They stood outside the barn, 4 people in what felt like opposing corners of a boxing ring. Samuel Porter had driven out to be present, and Walt was grateful for that. "Mr. Delaney," Jennifer said, her tone professionally cordial, "I understand you've retained counsel, which is certainly your right. However, I want to make clear that Sovereign Land Holdings has every legal right to this property. The deed is filed and recorded. Your continued presence here is technically trespassing." "Technically," Samuel countered, "there's a dispute over the validity of that deed. Until that dispute is resolved, my client has as much right to be here as your client does to claim." ownership. We're prepared to file for an injunction, and we're prepared to argue that the deed was obtained through fraud. Jennifer's professional smile didn't waver, but Walt saw something harden in her eyes. That's a very serious allegation. Do you have any proof? We're gathering evidence. Then gather it somewhere else. Sovereign has been patient, but that patience has limits. Cassidy Murdoch, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. Look, we're all reasonable people here. Walt, I understand you've got some attachment to this place. But facts are facts. We own this land. However, he paused, letting the word hang. Sovereign is willing to make a settlement offer. We'll pay you $10,000 for any inconvenience, give you 30 days to relocate, and we'll drop any trespassing complaints. That's more than fair, $10,000. It was more money than Walt had seen in one place in years. It would set him up somewhere else, give him breathing room, let him start over without the crushing weight of a legal battle he'd probably lose. Walt looked at Samuel, who gave him a subtle nod. It was Walt's decision. No, Walt said. Cassidy's expression flickered. No, this land is mine. I bought it legally. I'm not leaving, and I'm not taking money to pretend otherwise. You're making a mistake, maybe, but it's my mistake to make. After they left, Samuel stayed behind. He looked tired, and Walt understood why. This case would consume time and resources, with no guarantee of success. You sure about this? Samuel asked. 10,000 would solve a lot of problems. It would create more. If I take that money, I'm admitting they're right. I'm saying a man's word, and a legal auction don't mean anything when someone with more money wants what you have. Samuel nodded slowly. All right then, we fight. But you should know, I got a call from the hospital this morning. Garrett Hayes' medical records show he was admitted 6 months before his death. Stage 4 cancer, heavily medicated for pain. His doctor's notes indicate significant cognitive impairment from the medication and disease progression. Walt felt his pulse quicken. That proves he couldn't have legally signed that deed. It suggests it strongly, but we'll need more. A handwriting expert to analyze the signature, testimony from people who saw him during that time, anything that builds the case that he was incompetent to sign legal documents. How long will that take? Months, probably. And that's before we even get to court. Walt looked out at the land, at the hills rolling toward the horizon, at the barn and house that needed so much work but held so much promise. Months of legal battles, of uncertainty, of fighting against people with more power and resources. But what else did he have? Where else would he go? Then we take the time we need, Walt said. The first real blow came 3 weeks later. Walt was working on the barn roof when Samuel called with news that made his hands go cold. The judge denied our motion to seal Garrett's medical records from Sovereign's lawyers, Samuel said, his voice heavy with frustration. Which means they now know exactly what we know, and they're already preparing their counter-argument. Walt climbed down from the roof carefully, his phone pressed to his ear. What kind of counter-argument? They're claiming that Garrett had periods of lucidity, that the signature was obtained during one of those periods, and that we can't prove he was incompetent at that specific moment. They've got their own medical expert, who'll testify that cancer patients on medication can still understand and sign legal documents. That's a lie. It's a legal argument. And without witnesses who were present when the deed was signed, it becomes one expert's word against another's. Walt sat down heavily on a hay bale. Rufus wandered over and nudged his shoulder, sensing distress. There has to be something else, Walt said. I'm working on it. Patricia Reeves found some irregularities in the notary records. The notary who supposedly witnessed Garrett's signature has a history of complaints, mostly minor infractions, but nothing definitive enough to prove fraud. After the call ended, Walt sat for a long time in the barn's shadows. He'd known this would be hard, but knowing something intellectually and living through it were different experiences. Every step forward seemed to bring 2 steps back. Every piece of evidence they uncovered came with a counter-argument from Sovereign's lawyers. He thought about his grandfather, about the stories the old man used to tell. His grandfather had fought in a war, had come home to nothing, had built a life through sheer determination and refusal to quit. Sometimes, he'd told young Walt, the only way through is straight ahead, even when every sensible bone in your body says to turn back. That evening, Evelyn came by with dinner, pot roast and vegetables, still warm in a covered dish. They ate together in the barn, sitting on hay bales like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired." Sovereign pushing hard? They know what we know now. They're building their defense. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully. Then she said, "I did some asking around. Talk to folks who might have information about Sovereign's operations. And there's a pattern. Every property they've acquired in this valley, they got it from someone who was either in debt, sick, or both. They don't go after properties with clear ownership and no financial problems. They look for vulnerability and exploit it. Rare earth minerals, significant deposits of neodymium and dysprosium, essential components in electronics and green energy technology. The report estimated the mineral rights alone could be worth tens of millions of dollars. Suddenly, everything made sense. Sovereign hadn't wanted this land for development. They'd wanted the minerals underneath. They'd known Garrett's land held valuable resources, and they'd tried to pressure him into selling. When that failed, they'd forged his signature after he was too sick to fight back. Walt immediately called Samuel Porter. The lawyer answered on the second ring, and Walt could hear the exhaustion in his voice. He'd clearly been working late. "Samuel, I found something. You need to see this right now." "Walt, it's 10 o'clock at night. I don't care. This changes everything." Garrett left a will specifically saying he wanted the land auctioned. He left a letter detailing Sovereign's harassment. "And there's a geological survey showing mineral deposits worth millions." Silence on the other end. "Then I'll be there in 40 minutes. Samuel arrived in 35, his professional reserve cracked by genuine excitement. Walt showed him everything, the will, the letter, the survey. The lawyer read each document twice, his expression shifting from skepticism to wonder to something like vindication. "This is it," Samuel said. "This is everything we need. The will proves Garrett wanted the land auctioned, which means your purchase was legitimate. The letter proves Sovereign knew he didn't want to sell and details their harassment. And the survey," he whistled low, "the survey explains why they wanted this land so badly they were willing to commit fraud. Will it hold up in court?" "The documents are dated, signed, and hidden deliberately. Garrett clearly knew what he was doing when he preserved them. We'll need to verify the authenticity, get a handwriting expert to confirm it's his writing. But yes, this should absolutely hold up." Walt felt something release in his chest. A tension he'd been carrying for so long, he'd forgotten it was there. "So we can win?" "Better than that. With this evidence, Sovereign won't want to go to court. If this becomes public knowledge, if it gets out that they committed fraud to steal land with valuable mineral deposits, the legal consequences would be catastrophic. Not just civil penalties, potential criminal charges. What do we do?" Samuel gathered the documents carefully, treating them like the precious evidence they were. "We file an emergency motion with the court, present this new evidence, and request an immediate hearing. We'll also file a complaint with the district attorney's office, detailing the apparent fraud." And then he smiled, the first genuine smile Walt had seen from him. "Then we watch Sovereign scramble to save themselves." After Samuel left, Walt sat alone in the kitchen with just a lantern for light. He thought about Garrett Hayes, dying of cancer, knowing what Sovereign was trying to do, but unable to stop it himself. The old man had done the next best thing. He documented everything, hidden it where it might be found, and trusted that eventually someone would care enough to look. Walt ran his hand over the metal box, feeling the weight of that trust. Garrett had wanted this land to go to someone who would work it, love it, understand its value beyond profit. By sheer chance, or maybe something more than chance, Walt had been that person. Outside, Rufus let out a bray that sounded almost triumphant. Walt smiled in the darkness, allowing himself to feel something he'd tried not to feel for weeks: Victory. Not yet secured, but possible. Close enough to taste. The next morning, Walt woke to find Evelyn's truck already parked outside. She'd brought coffee and breakfast and news. "Heard something interesting yesterday," she said, as they sat on hay bales, eating eggs and toast. "Sovereign's been making quiet inquiries about settling disputes. Word is they're worried about something." "They should be," Walt said, and told her about what he'd found. Evelyn's eyes grew wide as he described the documents. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Garrett was a smart man. Smarter than people gave him credit for. He knew exactly what he was doing. He trusted someone would find it. He trusted someone would care enough to look. That's you, Walt. That's what you did." Walt thought about that, about trust and caring and the responsibility that came with finding something someone else had hidden for safekeeping. Garrett Hayes had been protecting more than just his land. He'd been protecting a legacy, a history, a way of life that was slowly disappearing. "We're going to win this," Walt said. "Not just for me. For Garrett. For everyone Sovereign has pushed around." Evelyn raised her coffee cup in a toast. "To Garrett. And to stubborn old men who don't know when to quit." They clinked cups. And for the first time since buying this land, Walt felt like it was truly his. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, which Samuel explained was remarkably fast for the legal system, but felt like an eternity to Walt. Those weeks were consumed with preparation, reviewing documents, rehearsing testimony, gathering every piece of evidence that could support their case. Samuel hired a handwriting expert, a woman named Dr. Ellen Richardson, who testified in dozens of fraud cases. She spent 2 days examining Garrett's letters to Margaret, comparing them to the signature on Sovereign's deed and the signature on the letter Garrett had hidden. Her conclusion was unambiguous. The signatures on the letters and hidden documents matched perfectly, showing the same hand pressure, the same letter formation, the same distinctive quirks. The signature on Sovereign's deed was similar but wrong in subtle ways, the work of someone skilled at forgery, but not perfect. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Richardson stated in her written report, "the signature on the Sovereign deed is a forgery. The individual who created it had access to examples of Mr. Hayes's handwriting, but lacked the fine motor control to replicate it exactly. Additionally, the signature shows hesitation marks consistent with someone copying rather than signing naturally." They also tracked down Thomas Brighton, the lawyer Garrett had mentioned in his letter. Brighton was semi-retired now, living in Laramie, but he remembered Garrett clearly. "Good man," Brighton said when Walt and Samuel visited him. "Principled. He came to me about 7 months before he died, said he wanted to update his will. Told me about Sovereign's harassment, about how they were pressuring him. He was scared they'd find some way to take his land after he died, so he wanted everything documented properly. Do you have a copy of that will?" Samuel asked. Brighton produced it from his files, an exact match to the one Walt had found hidden in the kitchen. The lawyer had filed it properly, but somehow it had been overlooked when Garrett died and Sovereign presented their fraudulent deed. "There was supposed to be an estate process," Brighton said, anger creeping into his voice. "But Sovereign moved so quickly, filed their deed so promptly, that by the time anyone questioned it, they'd already established apparent ownership. The county just assumed their documentation was legitimate. Did Garrett ever sign anything for Sovereign?" Walt asked. "Not while I represented him. He was adamant about that. He told me to tell anyone who asked that he would never, under any circumstances, sign away his land." Brighton agreed to testify, adding another credible voice to their case. But Sovereign wasn't idle during this time. Their lawyers filed motions to suppress evidence, arguing that the documents Walt found were of questionable provenance and couldn't be authenticated. They deposed Walt for 6 hours, trying to find inconsistencies in his story or suggest he'd fabricated the evidence. They hired their own handwriting expert, who produced a report claiming the signatures were potentially consistent, and that definitive conclusions couldn't be drawn. The pressure was constant and wearing. Walt began to understand why most people didn't fight companies like Sovereign. It was exhausting. all-consuming, and the outcome was never certain. There were nights when he lay in the barn, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he should have just taken the $10,000 and walked away. He'd be comfortable now, settled somewhere else, not facing the possibility of losing everything, including the legal fees he couldn't actually afford. But then he'd think about Garrett Hayes, about an old man who'd known he was dying but had still taken the time to document the truth and hide it where it might be found. Garrett had fought in his own way, with the tools available to him. Walt owed it to that fight to see this through. Evelyn remained a constant presence, bringing food and encouragement and practical help. She'd become something more than a neighbor, a friend, maybe the best friend Walt had ever had. They'd sit in the barn after long days of preparation, drinking coffee and not saying much, just being present for each other. "You know," she said one evening, "win or lose, you've already done something important. You've stood up to them. You've made them work for it, made them sweat. That matters. Doesn't matter if I lose the land. It matters because other people are watching. Other folks Sovereign has tried to push around. You've shown them it's possible to fight back. That's not illegal, no, but it suggests a strategy. They identify targets, wait for the right moment, then move in with offers that seem generous, but are really just enough to make desperate people agree to things they wouldn't otherwise consider." Walt thought about Garrett Hayes, dying of cancer, alone in a hospital, worried about what would happen to his land. The perfect target. The question is, Evelyn continued, did they wait for Garrett to be vulnerable enough to sign, or did they forge his signature knowing he was too sick to fight back? "Samuel says we need proof. Witnesses, evidence, something concrete. Maybe we're looking in the wrong place. Maybe instead of proving the signature was forged, we prove that Sovereign had reason to forge it, that they knew Garrett would never willingly sell." It was a different angle, and Walt turned it over in his mind. If they could show that Sovereign had approached Garrett before and been refused, that would establish motive. If they could show Sovereign had a pattern of questionable acquisitions, that would establish method. Over the next few days, Walt and Evelyn became investigators of sorts. They talked to former employees of the ranches Sovereign had acquired, asking about how those sales had gone down. They found a pattern. In each case, Sovereign had approached the owners multiple times, increasing pressure with each visit. A former hand from the Peterson ranch told them that Jim Peterson had refused Sovereign's offers 3 times before his bank had called in a loan unexpectedly, forcing him to sell. The timing had seemed suspicious at the time, but nobody had thought to question it. A woman whose father had owned the McAllister place said Sovereign had sent representatives every month for a year, each time raising the offer, each time being refused. Then her father had a stroke, and while he was recovering, someone had gotten him to sign papers he didn't fully understand. The picture that emerged was of a company that didn't take no for an answer, that used every legal and semi-legal tool to acquire what it wanted. Walt brought this information to Samuel, who listened with growing interest. "This is good," Samuel said. "It establishes a pattern of aggressive acquisition tactics. But we still need something that directly connects to Garrett's case, evidence that they approached him and were refused. How do we find that? Bank records might show if Sovereign made any financial offers. Phone records could show if there were communications between them. Or," Samuel paused, considering, "or we find someone who witnessed those interactions." Walt thought about the people he'd interviewed, the neighbors and friends who'd known Garrett. Most of them were elderly themselves, their memories sometimes hazy. But there was one person he hadn't talked to yet, Garrett's doctor. Dr. Michael Thornton had a practice in Clearwater and had been Garrett's primary physician for the last 15 years of his life. Walt made an appointment, presenting himself as someone researching Garrett's estate. The doctor was cautious at first, citing patient confidentiality, but when Walt explained the situation, that someone might have taken advantage of his patient in his final months, Thornton's professional reserve cracked. Garrett talked about Sovereign, the doctor said. This was maybe 8 months before he died, during one of his regular checkups. He was agitated about it, said some company had been pressuring him to sell his ranch. that they wouldn't take no for an answer. Walt's heart raced. Did he mention any specifics? He said a man named Murdoch kept coming around, making offers, hinting that things might get difficult if Garrett didn't cooperate. Garrett was frightened, I think, though he tried to hide it. He asked me if there was any way they could force him to sell. What did you tell him? I told him that as long as he owned the property free and clear and was of sound mind, nobody could force him to do anything. He seemed relieved. The doctor's expression darkened. 2 months later, he was admitted to the hospital with advanced cancer. By 6 months, he was barely conscious most days from the pain medication. There's no way he understood what he was signing during that time, if he signed anything at all. Would you be willing to testify to that? Dr. Thornton hesitated, clearly weighing professional obligations against personal conviction. Finally, he nodded. If it means stopping people from taking advantage of dying patients, yes. I'll testify. Walt left the doctor's office feeling something he hadn't felt in weeks: momentum. They had a witness who could testify to Garrett's state of mind, to Sovereign's harassment, to the impossibility of him competently signing legal documents in his final months. That night, Walt called Samuel with the news. The lawyer's excitement was palpable. "This changes things," Samuel said. "With Dr. Thornton's testimony, we can argue that not only was Garrett incompetent to sign, but that Sovereign knew it and took advantage. That's fraud pure and simple, so we can win." Samuel's pause was careful. "We have a stronger case, but Sovereign will fight hard. They'll attack Thornton's credibility, argue about medical privacy, try to exclude his testimony. This is far from over, but it was a beginning. It was hope with substance behind it. And that was enough to keep Walt going, through another day, another week, another month of uncertainty and struggle. The discovery came by accident, the way important things often do. Walt had been working on the house, trying to make it habitable before winter arrived in earnest. The kitchen was his current project, a space that needed everything from new pipes to functioning electricity. He'd been pulling out old cabinets when one came loose from the wall entirely, revealing a gap in the plaster behind it. In that gap, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked away like a secret, was a metal box. Walt extracted it carefully, his hands trembling slightly as he set it on what remained of the kitchen counter. The box wasn't locked, just latched, and inside he found documents wrapped in more oilcloth, papers that Garrett Hayes had clearly hidden, wanting them safe but accessible. The first document was a will. Not the one filed with the county, but a later version, dated 1 month before Garrett died. Walt's breath caught as he read it. "I, Garrett Michael Hayes, being of sound mind and clear purpose, do hereby revoke all previous wills and declare this to be my last will and testament. Having no living heirs, and wishing to see this land continue in the tradition my grandfather established, I leave the entirety of my property, house, barn, land, water rights, and mineral rights, to be sold at public auction, with proceeds to establish a scholarship fund for agricultural students at the University of Wyoming. It is my express wish that this land go to someone who will work it, love it, and understand its value beyond mere profit." Walt read the paragraph 3 more times, making sure he understood. Garrett had wanted the land auctioned. He'd specifically intended for it to go to someone who would care for it properly, which meant the county auction that Walt had attended had been exactly what Garrett wanted. But there was more. Beneath the will was another document, a letter addressed to whom it may concern, in Garrett's handwriting. This handwriting was shaky but clear, nothing like the signature on Sovereign's deed. The letter was dated 7 months before Garrett died, right around the time Sovereign claimed he'd signed over the property. Walt read it slowly, his anger building with each sentence. "To whom it may concern, I am writing this as a record of events, should anything happen to me. For the past 6 months, a company called Sovereign Land Holdings, represented by a man named Cassidy Murdoch, has been pressuring me to sell my ranch. I have refused multiple times, making it clear I have no intention of selling now or ever. Last week, Mr. Murdoch came to my house with another man he introduced as a lawyer. They brought papers they said would protect my interests and ensure my legacy. I refused to sign anything without my own lawyer present. They became aggressive, suggesting that if I didn't cooperate, they could make things difficult, that they had connections with the bank, with the county assessor, with people who could create problems for me. I am an old man, dying of cancer, but I'm not a fool. I know what they're trying to do. This land has been in my family since my great-grandfather homesteaded it. It represents 4 generations of work, love, and commitment. I will not let it be stolen by men in expensive suits who see only profit. If I am found to have signed any documents giving away or selling this property, know that it was done under duress or is an outright forgery. My wishes are clear and documented in my most recent will, filed with my lawyer, Thomas Brighton, in Laramie. This land is my legacy. It deserves someone who will honor it. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably Garrett's, the same confident hand that appeared in his letters to Margaret. Nothing like the shaky scrawl on Sovereign's deed. Walt's hands shook as he set the letter down. This changed everything. This wasn't just evidence of fraud, it was proof of intent to defraud, proof that Garrett had known what Sovereign was trying to do and had taken steps to prevent it. But there was one more document in the box. A survey report stamped confidential and dated 8 months before Garrett died. It detailed a geological survey of the property conducted by a firm Walt didn't recognize. The findings made his breath catch. Walt hadn't thought about it that way, but she was right. Word had spread through the valley about his case. People he'd never met would stop him in town, wish him luck, tell him stories about their own run-ins with Sovereign. The case had become bigger than just one old cowboy and 50 acres. It had become a symbol of resistance against corporate greed. Sheriff Brickland stopped by a few days before the hearing. He wasn't in uniform, which told Walt this was a personal visit rather than official business. "Wanted to see how you're holding up," the sheriff said. "Nervous. That's understandable. Big day coming." Brickland looked around the property at the repairs Walt had made despite the ongoing legal battle. "Place looks better. Figured I might as well fix it up while I'm here." Good attitude. The sheriff was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been doing some digging on my own time. Nothing official, just asking questions. Found out that Sovereign's been under investigation in 2 other states for similar practices, pressuring elderly landowners, questionable deed transfers. Nothing's been proven yet, but there's smoke. Why are you telling me this? Because if your case goes the way I think it might, if you prove fraud, it could open up investigations in those other states too. You might be starting something bigger than you realize." After Brickland left, Walt sat with that information. The weight of it felt both heavy and somehow right. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about justice for everyone Sovereign had wronged. The night before the hearing, Walt couldn't sleep. He walked the property under starlight, Rufus following along like a patient shadow. He thought about every moment that had led here, the auction, the discovery of the cattle, Cassidy Murdoch's dismissive smile, finding Garrett's hidden documents. Any one of those moments could have gone differently. He could have not raised his hand at the auction. He could have left when Cassidy told him to. He could have never found those hidden papers. The thread of chance that had brought him here felt impossibly thin, but maybe that's how important things always were, balanced on the edge of chance and choice, requiring someone to be in the right place at the right time, and stubborn enough to stay there. Samuel called that night to go over final preparations. "How are you feeling?" the lawyer asked. "Terrified." "Good. That means you understand the stakes." Samuel's voice was calm, grounding. "Listen, Walt, I need you to understand something. Even with all our evidence, with everything we've gathered, this isn't guaranteed. Sovereign has resources, connections, and very good lawyers. The judge might look at all of this and still decide there's reasonable doubt about the fraud. Are you prepared for that? Are you telling me we're going to lose? I'm telling you it's possible. I want you to go into that courtroom with your eyes open." Walt thought about it, about losing, about having to leave this land, about Sovereign winning through sheer legal force despite the evidence. The thought made him sick, but he'd been living with that possibility for weeks now. "I understand," Walt said, "but we're still fighting." "Damn right we are." The morning of the hearing, Walt put on the only suit he owned, bought decades ago for a funeral and worn maybe 3 times since. It didn't fit quite right anymore, too loose in some places and too tight in others. But it was respectful, and that's what mattered. Evelyn drove him to the courthouse in Rawlins. She'd insisted on coming along, said she wouldn't miss it for anything. In the truck, she reached over and squeezed his hand. "However this goes," she said, "you've got a friend. You've got people who believe in you. Thank you." "And Walt? That land is yours. In every way that matters, it's already yours. A judge might say otherwise, but the truth is the truth." The courthouse was an old building, limestone and tall windows, with the weight of 100 years of decisions pressing down on its foundation. Walt climbed the steps slowly, Samuel beside him, Evelyn just behind. Inside, the halls echoed with footsteps and hushed conversations. Sovereign's legal team was already there, Jennifer Kane and 3 other lawyers, all dressed impeccably, all carrying leather briefcases that probably cost more than Walt's truck. Cassidy Murdoch stood with them, looking confident and relaxed. He caught Walt's eye and gave a small nod, almost respectful. Whatever happened today, they'd both know where things stood afterward. The courtroom itself was smaller than Walt expected, wood-paneled and formal, with an American flag in one corner and the state flag in the other. Judge Margaret Holloway presided, a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and an expression that suggested she'd heard every argument and excuse and wasn't impressed by any of them. Samuel had briefed Walt about Holloway. She was known for being fair but hard, impatient with legal maneuvering, but willing to consider evidence carefully. This case would be decided on facts, not sympathy. As they took their seats, Walt felt the weight of what was about to happen settle over him like a physical thing. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd hoped for, would be decided in this room by people who'd never stood on that land, never felt the wind coming down from the mountains, never understood what it meant to finally have something worth fighting for. Judge Holloway banged her gavel, and the hearing began. Samuel Porter stood to present their case, and Walt was struck by how different the lawyer looked in this setting. Gone was the rumpled, overworked appearance. In its place was confidence and clarity, a man who knew his case and believed in it. "Your Honor," Samuel began, "this is a straightforward case of fraud and forgery. The defendant, Sovereign Land Holdings, obtained a deed to property belonging to Garrett Hayes through deception, either forging his signature or obtaining it when Mr. Hayes was mentally incompetent due to terminal illness. We have substantial evidence to support this claim, including medical records, witness testimony, and documents in Mr. Hayes' own hand that directly contradict the defendant's claims." Jennifer Kane rose to respond, her voice smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's case rests on speculation and convenient discoveries. Sovereign Land Holdings obtained their deed through proper legal channels. It was signed, notarized, and filed according to all applicable laws. The plaintiff's recent discovery of contradictory documents is highly suspicious in timing and authenticity." Judge Holloway listened without expression, then gestured for Samuel to proceed with his evidence. The first witness was Dr. Thornton. He took the stand with the gravity of someone who understood the weight of his testimony. Under Samuel's questioning, he described Garrett's condition in his final months, the progression of cancer, the heavy pain medication, the cognitive impairment that made complex decisions impossible. "In your professional medical opinion," Samuel asked, "would Mr. Hayes have been capable of understanding and signing legal documents 6 months before his death?" "No," Dr. Thornton said firmly. At that stage, Garrett was experiencing significant cognitive decline. He was on doses of morphine that would make lucid thought difficult on good days, impossible on bad ones. He certainly wouldn't have been competent to sign away property worth millions. Jennifer Kane's cross-examination was sharp but measured. Dr. Thornton, you said good days and bad ones. Is it possible that Mr. Hayes could have had a lucid moment when he was capable of signing documents? Anything is possible, but highly unlikely given, but possible? Technically, yes, but thank you. Dr. Patricia Reeves testified next, detailing the irregularities in how Sovereign's deed had been filed, the rushed timing, the notary's questionable history, the lack of standard documentation that should have accompanied such a significant transaction. Thomas Brighton followed, describing Garrett's explicit instructions that he would never sell his land, and the will that specifically called for the property to be auctioned after his death. With each witness, Walt watched Judge Holloway take notes, her expression revealing nothing. Sovereign's lawyers objected regularly, creating a rhythm of challenge and response that made Walt's head spin. Legal terminology flew back and forth, hearsay, speculation, foundation, words that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. Then came Dr. Richardson, the handwriting expert. She brought enlarged photographs of signatures, pointing out specific details that distinguished genuine writing from forgery. The signature on Sovereign's deed shows these characteristics, she explained, using a laser pointer on the projected images. Notice the hesitation here, at the beginning of the G in Garrett. That's consistent with someone copying. Notice also the pressure variation. It's too uniform, lacks the natural variation of someone signing their own name. In comparison, these signatures from Mr. Hayes's personal letters show fluid motion, variable pressure, and natural pen lifts. The difference is clear and conclusive, and your professional opinion. Samuel asked, the signature on Sovereign's deed is a forgery. I can state that with 95% certainty. The courtroom felt charged with that statement, heavy with implication. Walt glanced at Cassidy Murdoch, who maintained his composed exterior but whose jaw had tightened noticeably. Jennifer Kane's cross-examination focused on the 5% uncertainty. So you can't be completely certain? No expert can claim 100% certainty in handwriting analysis. But 95% represents a very high degree of confidence, beyond reasonable doubt in practical terms. Finally, Samuel called Walt to the stand. Walt's legs felt unsteady as he walked forward, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Samuel's questions were straightforward. When did you buy the property? What happened when you returned? What did you find in the kitchen? Walt answered as clearly as he could, trying to remember everything Samuel had coached him about. Speak directly to the judge. Don't elaborate beyond what's asked. Stay calm. When it came time to describe finding Garrett's hidden documents, Walt felt the full weight of the moment. I pulled out an old cabinet and found a metal box behind it. Inside were papers, a will, a letter, a survey report, all hidden deliberately, like someone wanted them found, but wanted them safe. And what did those documents tell you? Samuel asked. That Garrett Hayes never wanted to sell his land, that he'd been harassed by Sovereign, and that there were valuable mineral deposits they were trying to steal. Jennifer Kane's cross-examination of Walt was designed to paint him as opportunistic, desperate, willing to fabricate evidence to get what he wanted. Mr. Delaney, you're 60 years old with limited means, correct? Yes. You've worked as a ranch hand your entire life, never owning property? That's right. So when you saw that ranch for $50, you saw an opportunity, a chance to finally have something of your own. I saw a chance, yes. And when Sovereign proved they legally owned the property, you were disappointed. Angry even. I was both those things. Angry enough to create false documents, to pretend you'd found papers that conveniently supported your claim. Walt met her eyes steadily. No, ma'am. I found those papers exactly where I said I did. And they're real. How convenient that you found them at just the right time. Or maybe it was supposed to happen that way. Maybe Garrett hid them, hoping someone would care enough to look. Samuel objected. Calls for speculation. But Walt had said what needed saying. Judge Holloway sustained the objection, but gave Walt a long look that might have held the slightest hint of understanding. Sovereign called their own witnesses, the notary who claimed to have witnessed Garrett's signature, their handwriting expert who disputed Dr. Richardson's findings, and Cassidy Murdoch himself. who testified smoothly about standard business practices and proper documentation procedures, but their case felt hollow compared to the weight of evidence Samuel had presented. The notary's testimony was shaky, full of convenient memory lapses. Their handwriting expert hedged and qualified every statement. And Cassidy Murdoch, for all his polish, couldn't explain why Garrett Hayes would have signed over land worth millions when he'd spent a lifetime protecting it. After both sides rested their cases, Judge Holloway called for a recess to review the evidence. The wait was excruciating, 2 hours that felt like days, with Walt sitting on a hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, unable to eat or drink or think about anything except what might be happening behind those closed doors. Evelyn sat beside him, silent and solid. Samuel paced, reviewing notes, muttering to himself. Sovereign's team looked confident, but Walt noticed Jennifer Kane checking her phone repeatedly, her professional mask slipping to reveal something like concern. When they were called back in, Judge Holloway's expression was grave. She had papers in front of her, documents she'd clearly spent the recess studying carefully. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented," she began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "This is not a simple case. Both parties have presented compelling arguments and substantial documentation. However, the law requires me to make a determination, based on the preponderance of evidence, which version of events is more likely to be true." Walt's heart hammered, so hard he could feel it in his throat. "The evidence presented by the plaintiff is substantial and troubling," Judge Holloway continued. "Medical records clearly show that Garrett Hayes was severely compromised by illness and medication at the time he allegedly signed Sovereign's deed. Dr. Richardson's handwriting analysis, while not absolute, presents strong evidence of forgery. Mr. Hayes' letter, assuming it is authenticated, and I see no reason to doubt that authentication, directly contradicts Sovereign's claims and describes a pattern of harassment and pressure." She paused, adjusting her glasses to read from her notes. "Furthermore, the existence of a properly filed will that specifically calls for the property to be auctioned, a will that was mysteriously overlooked when Sovereign filed their deed, raises serious questions about the legitimacy of Sovereign's claim. The geological survey showing valuable mineral deposits provides clear motive for fraud." Jennifer Kane stood. "Your Honor, if I may, you may not." Judge Holloway's tone was sharp. "I've heard your arguments. Now you'll hear my ruling." The room went completely silent. "I find that Sovereign Land Holdings obtained their deed through fraudulent means, either through outright forgery or through obtaining a signature from someone who was mentally incompetent to provide informed consent. The deed filed by Sovereign is hereby declared void and without legal effect. The property in question reverts to its proper disposition under Garrett Hayes's will, specifically to the legal buyer at the county auction." Walt's breath left him in a rush. The words took a moment to fully register. To move from sound to meaning to reality, they'd won. "Furthermore," Judge Holloway continued, her voice taking on a steelier edge, "I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal investigation. The evidence suggests deliberate fraud, and such conduct cannot be tolerated in this court's jurisdiction." She brought her gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the courtroom and into Walt's very bones. "This hearing is concluded. Mr. Delaney, the property is legally yours." Walt sat frozen for a long moment, unable to move or speak. Then Evelyn was hugging him, and Samuel was shaking his hand. And somewhere in the background, he could hear Sovereign's lawyers arguing in hushed, urgent tones about appeals and next steps, but none of that mattered right now. Right now, in this moment, the land was his. Truly, legally, finally his. 3 months later, Walt stood in the doorway of the barn watching winter arrive in earnest. Snow had fallen during the night, covering the land in white that sparkled under morning sun. The barn roof was solid now, properly repaired. The house had windows that closed, a door that locked, a kitchen where coffee percolated on a functioning stove. Rufus stood in the newly fenced pasture, his grey coat dusted with snow, looking distinctly unimpressed with the weather. Walt smiled, watching the donkey's theatrical display of suffering. Some things never changed. The legal aftermath had been complicated, but ultimately satisfying. Sovereign had initially threatened to appeal, but when the district attorney's office opened a criminal investigation, they'd quietly withdrawn. Cassidy Murdoch had resigned, and last Walt heard he was cooperating with investigators looking into Sovereign's practices in other states. The company itself was facing multiple lawsuits from people who'd been pressured into selling their land under questionable circumstances. Walt's case had opened a door. Sheriff Brickland had been right about that. Other people had found the courage to question deals they'd been pressured into, to demand investigations into signatures they couldn't remember signing. The dominoes were still falling, and Walt suspected they'd keep falling for some time. The county had issued him a new deed, clean, clear, and indisputable. It hung framed on the wall of his bedroom, though Walt found he didn't look at it much anymore. The paper didn't matter as much as the reality it represented. This land was his, and he could feel that truth in his bones every morning when he woke up here. Evelyn's truck appeared on the road, right on schedule. She'd taken to joining him for breakfast most mornings, a routine they'd fallen into without discussing it. She brought eggs from her chickens and he made coffee, and they'd sit in the kitchen talking about the day ahead, or sometimes not talking at all, just being comfortable in silence. Snow came early this year, she said, stamping her boots before coming inside. Makes the work harder, makes it beautiful too. She handed him the egg basket and poured herself coffee. Had a call from Patricia Reeves yesterday. Said 3 more people have come forward with questions about their land deals with Sovereign. Your case has people thinking. That's good. It's more than good. It's important. She studied him over her coffee cup. You look settled. I am settled. First time in my life. It suits you. They ate breakfast together, scrambled eggs and toast, simple and satisfying. Through the window, Walt could see the land stretching away toward the horizon. The same view Garrett Hayes had seen for 40 years. He understood now why the old man had fought so hard to protect it. This wasn't just property. It was peace, possibility, and purpose all rolled into one. After breakfast, Walt walked the property as he did every morning. The creek was partially frozen but still flowing. The cattle he'd managed to recover from Sovereign's holding pens, they'd been legally obligated to return them, grazed in the far pasture, fattened up and healthy now. He'd bought more at auction, building a small herd that would grow over time. Near the southern boundary, he found the old stone marker he'd discovered that first week. He'd cleaned it up, made sure it was visible and honored. 4 generations of Hayes family history, and now Walt Delaney carrying it forward. It felt right, like he'd been meant to find this place all along. Samuel Porter had stopped by last week with final paperwork and a bill that was less than Walt had feared. The lawyer had taken a smaller percentage than they'd agreed upon, saying something about it being worth it just to see Sovereign squirm. They'd shaken hands like old friends, because that's what they'd become through all of this. In town, people knew Walt now. They nodded when he passed, asked how the ranch was coming along, told him they were glad he'd stood his ground. He was part of the community in a way he'd never been anywhere else, not just accepted, but respected. But the best moments were the quiet ones. Evenings when he'd sit on the porch he'd repaired, watching the sun set over his land, and feel a contentment so complete it almost hurt. Or mornings like this one, when fresh snow made everything clean and new, and the work ahead felt like privilege rather than burden. Garrett Hayes' photograph, the one Walt had found in the barn, now sat on the mantel in the house. Sometimes Walt would look at it and feel a connection across time. 2 men who'd loved the same piece of earth, who'd understood its value beyond money or convenience. Thank you, Walt would sometimes say to that photograph. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for hiding those papers. Thank you for trusting someone would find them. The mineral deposits were still there, under the soil, worth millions according to the surveys. Mining companies had already started making inquiries, offering sums that would make Walt wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined. He'd turn them all down without hesitation. The land was worth more than the minerals underneath it. Garrett had known that, and now Walt did too. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill, Walt headed back to the barn. There was fence to check, cattle to feed, 100 small tasks that came with ranching. Hard work, satisfying work, the kind that earned its rest at day's end. Rufus met him at the barn door, nudging Walt's shoulder with his big head. The donkey's presence had been constant through everything, the uncertainty, the legal battle, the eventual triumph. A stubborn companion for a stubborn man. We did it, Walt told him. We're home. Rufus made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been a request for breakfast. With Rufus, it was always hard to tell. Walt laughed, a sound that came easier now than it had in years, and headed inside to start another day on the ranch. Ranch, his home. His legacy to protect and pass on, just as Garrett had hoped someone would. Sometimes a man's last chance costs $50 and everything he has left to lose. But sometimes, just sometimes, that chance pays off in ways that can't be measured in money or counted in acres. It pays off in belonging, in purpose, in the simple, profound truth of finally being exactly where you're meant to be. And that, Walt had learned, was worth fighting for.